Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, it's my turn. I picked a story called To Build a Fire by Jack London.
Classic.
Yes. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. He thought in the moment of controlled despair that ensued. After 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands. His arm muscles, not being frozen, enabled him to press the hand heels tightly against the matches. Then he scratched the bunch along his leg. It flared into flame, 70 sulphur matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes and held the blazing bunch to the birch bark. As he so held it, he became aware of sensation in his hand. His flesh was burning. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface, he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute, and still he endured it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. At last, when he could endure no more, he jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow, but the birch bark was alight. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. It meant life, and it must not perish. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver, and he grew more awkward. A large piece of green moss fell squarely on the little fire. He tried to poke it out with his fingers, but his shivering frame made him poke too far, and he disrupted the nucleus of the little fire. The burning grasses and tiny twigs separating and scattering. He tried to poke them together again, but in spite of the tenseness of the effort, his shivering got away with him, and the twigs were hopelessly scattered. Each twig gushed a puff of smoke and went out. The fire provider had failed. As he looked apathetically about him, his eyes chanced on the dog, sitting across the ruins of the fire from him now, in the snow, making restless hunching movements, slightly lifting one forefoot and then the other, shifting its weight back and forth on them with wistful eagerness. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the tale of the man caught in a blizzard who killed a steer and crawled inside the carcass and so was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal, who had never known the man to speak in such a way before. Something was the matter, and its suspicious nature sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. It flattened its ears down at the sound of the man's voice, and its restless hunching movements and the liftings and shiftings of its forefeet became more pronounced, but it would not come to the man. He got on his hands and knees and crawled toward the dog. This unusual posture again excited suspicion, and the animal sidled mincingly away. So I forget how I came across this story, but I really enjoyed it actually. I remember enjoying Jack London for all the same reasons in seventh grade. Where they were just these kind of like I don't want to call them simple stories, but they're like very straightforward. Like the story at hand is the story at hand. He's trying to build a fire. So that's the story. And in this story, he fails to do it and he dies. And there's not even necessarily, I mean, we start this story out, which is kind of interesting, with the narrator telling us that this guy doesn't think about a whole lot. He's like, as this man, walks through the beautiful wilderness, he's looking at the beautiful wilderness, not for its beauty, but for, what it means for his trek. And he's like a very practical guy and whatever. He's thoughtful, but he's not contemplating in that moment, the meaning of life or how small he is or how fragile everything is, right? There's like this disclaimer at the beginning that like this is not a guy that thinks this way. This is not going to be this poetic, meaningful story. So when he's like struggling to build this fire and he's like grappling with the fact that he's probably going to die, there's not even like a moment at the end like that Hemingway story that we just read where he's in and out of consciousness because he's what happened with him? He's got gangrene or something.
Gangrene, yeah.
So he's like in a fever dream and he's doing what Hemingway does best, which is wax poetic about his stupid life. And this guy's over here just like, oh shit, I'm gonna die. And he's not thinking like I'm gonna miss my family or like I'm really sad or what a beautiful place to die. He's just like going through the actual physical reactions of it and like the kind of like instinctual motions that you go through where this is dire. I could do this now. I could try this now. I liked that about it.
It's interesting. I forgot about that. The thing you mentioned right in the beginning, he's a newcomer to the land, and this was his
Yeah.
first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He
Yeah.
was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things like this is like commentary on him, which I forgot because, like you said, the rest of the story, and this is my main comment, was it's so immediate. Everything that happens is
Right.
immediate to like the situation. We don't need a lot of backstory. Things that he remembers come up because they're useful to the moment. They're part of
Right.
the current moment. The
Right.
memory of them is part of the current moment. They're always
Yeah.
immediate. But
Right.
that commentary on him is like the narrator stepping back and telling us, like, just give it. It's like a scene setting thing. Obviously, it's a character
Yeah.
setting thing. But
Yeah.
then once we get into him, the narrator doesn't do that anymore.
No, it's just like a disclaimer. And
Yeah.
it's interesting too. He's like, just so you know, this guy's not going to think of a whole lot.
Yeah, he's like, this is just going to be what it is. He's not really that
Yeah.
interesting of a guy.
But I wonder too, like,
Although, don't worry, I'll jump into the dog's head so you can get some other point of view once in a
yeah,
while.
yeah, the dogs thinks of a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that section that you read where, because I remember that now, where he talked about like his lack of imagination. That almost seems like criticism in hindsight. Like maybe Jack London is like, if this guy had a little bit more of it, maybe he could have figured out a way to live, or I don't know. But I don't get that sense that it's not as if this man overlooks some solution.
Yeah, he was a newcomer in the land, Chachaco. I don't know how to say it. And this was his first winter. It's become so different that, like, you lands differently once you know how the story ends, right?
Right.
It does feel like a condemnation.
Right. So what I ended up liking about it was that because it is like so straightforward, what really comes across is, for me, it was like this tone, There's like no dialogue. It's just like the guy thinking to himself and calls the dog over at one point. So it's like a quiet story, and it's like very sad and like lonely and like cold, literally, and like desperate. All of that comes across because of the fact that he is traveling alone and experiencing this alone and thinking out loud. And if you think about like if this were a movie, how they would have to ruin it so that we would know what was happening in his head, and they would have to ruin it with like a monologue, the
No.
guy would be saying things.
You ever see that Robert Redford movie about him on a sailboat?
No.
There's like no dialogue. He might
Okay.
say one
Yeah.
thing one time, but it's
So it can
just
be done
him.
for sure. Yeah.
It was an interesting movie, and I could see this being done in the same way,
Yeah,
where
I
it's
could
for
see them
nothing.
trying. Yeah, and I'm sure we could think of other movies like that one where in moments of I mean, I'm thinking right now of the Tom Hanks movie with the volleyball. Is it
Oh
Castaway?
yeah, yeah, Castaway.
I mean, like he talks to
Then they
himself a
gave him
lot.
Wilson so that he'd talk to the
Exactly. That's what I
ball.
mean. That's what I mean. Like you can only do it for so long before like you worry that the audience needs to hear Tom Hank talk.
But you gotta get paid. You gotta have lines as an actor, or else you're not gonna get the money, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, we could just cast extras. So, but obviously, the effect in prose is that it feels that way, but it's appropriate for this story because he is alone. It is the wilderness. It is desperate. It is
Yeah.
cold and quiet. Like, I mean, there's science behind why when it snows really heavily, you go outside and things are quiet because the snow, like, literally deadens sound.
That's right.
Yeah, there's like cool things about that actually come across in this because everything that Jack London is describing is a direct result of how this man is interacting with the setting. And
Yeah.
my main takeaway from this was, when we like read stories and people spend a lot of time like only at the beginning describing a setting, if it's especially a natural setting, they'll be like, oh, the waves were blue and the sky was blue and it was really nice out. And they think that they're being like really poetic when they, describe a tree in a way they've never seen a tree described. And then they just like get into the story and they stop describing the setting because they think that you've gotten it. And I'm not saying I'm good at this, and I'm sure I've talked about this on the podcast before, but having moved from Ohio to Florida, setting for me as a person and as a writer became like so much more exciting because anything that happened to me in Florida happened when it was hot out. Like heat was a factor. Humidity
Florida
was always a
was
factor.
part of it.
Yeah, Florida was like a lot
Florida
of
can't help but be part of it.
exactly. And just the comparison, even. Like, I'm sure if I moved from Ohio to Pennsylvania, I would have like experienced something similar where like your surroundings, natural world or otherwise, right? But especially the natural world, like that is a big, big, big part in the tone of your story. And in here, it's everything. It's the plot, it's the tone, it's everything. But Jack London, there's like a certain poetry in just describing it at face value. He's not over here like using metaphors and shit. He's not trying to make it sound like what he's describing is he's doing it like because he wants you to be wowed by his actual prose. But he just consistently is telling you what's happening around this man. It's so simple, it's so straightforward, but I can not only picture it, but I'm getting the sense of like the setting is the character. Like this quiet earth as it exists that's a thing. It's a presence in this story. So jumping to my takeaway, like I love stories with settings like this where the setting is integral. It's important.
Whoever came up with the man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature. This is like exemplar of the man versus nature, right?
Yes.
And so the one end, man versus nature is the other end. It's all about the setting. It's like everything that happens is his interaction with that setting.
Right.
You're right. So often when writing, leave that out. Even in a story where two people are talking, like the setting can be an extra character, kind of modulates their engagement. They work through the setting to get to each other.
Yeah. And like I said, it doesn't have to always be like a natural setting. Like they could be in an office park and talking about like the other buildings and
like if you want to throw something at somebody, what are you going to pick up? Where are you?
Yeah, sure. A stapler
In the office. You're a handful of snow out in the park.
I think we're all guilty of this, where if you're reading a story and you really had to tell me, like in any point in the story, if I stopped you and said, where are they? What does it look like? You might not know. You might have like no clue. And you might have thought up until I asked you that you had a firm grasp because you understand what's happening. You understand what the conversation has to do with what's going on next and what the thought process has to do with what's going on next. But I would almost guarantee in most cases that like your story would be richer if you told me, you know, where this character was when they were thinking this thing or where these characters were when they were talking to each other or walking or, you know.
That's probably one of those like kind of quote unquote easy ways to thicken up a story that feels too thin.
Yeah, I've found myself doing that exact thing. I've written stories, like I said, about Florida. I have to remind myself why I started writing the story, and it was because Florida's really fucking hot and I had to like reinsert that. So like, yeah, there's like parts where it feels thin, but even I've lost sight of the point, and so I got to go back and kind of flesh it out. And yeah, it feels thin until you do that.
I often see this advice to writers. It's like, okay, get your first draft and then cut 10%.
Yeah, I know.
Because you always overwrite. I find myself doing the exact opposite. It's like I write a skeleton and then I have to go layer crap in because I left it out. It's like, no, this needs more setting. This needs more. I need another scene about this character because of that. Or this character feels like nothing. Who are they? And I got to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wonder why that is for you. Like, I know for me, it's like a journalism thing and like a patience thing, where a lot of times what I'm writing is like either concise because that's how I've learned to write, or it's concise because I'm so lazy and I don't want to spend any more time on it. But I wonder what it is for you. Because I have to do the same thing for my work. Whereas I do read other people's and I'm like, I would cut some of this garbage and certainly add more other things.
That is true. The advice is not bad. You do want to cut the 10% because most of the time you overwrite things, or people tend to overwrite things. So you cut 10%, but then you got to layer in the things you missed. I think for me, I have the idea and I run with the idea and I don't hang enough on it, right, to make it a full story. But I recognize I don't turn those into the workshop. I usually recognize it and I go back and I don't jot something off in like 10 minutes and then submit it. I work on it and then I submit it.
Right.
One thing that I noticed about there's two moments that happen where it uses the line and then it happened. So he's walking through the snow and then it happened at a place where there were no signs, where the soft unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidity beneath. The man broke through. It was not deep. He wet himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out of the firm crust. This had been set up before. Like he had discovered one of these places where there was unfrozen water in a layer. And so we knew that was a danger. And so then when it finally occurred, when it happened to him, the line it's introduced with, and then it happened. And that same thing happened later when he's trying to build the fire and he's got it going. It says, but before he could cut the strings, it happened.
Yeah.
It was his own fault. And this is when the snow fell on the fire. So these are two pivotal moments that like kind of seal his fate, right? It's kind of like a narrative way it doesn't build suspense exactly, but it's a narrative way to show us that it's a pivotal thing.
It feels like it goes back to his original disclaimer about this man. Like, he's not imaginative, but when it says things like, and then it happened, it's like, here's a guy who he's new to this terrain, but on some level, he's anticipating that at every turn there's danger in terms of what can naturally happen, right? So to say like, and then it happened is kind of like, there's not suspense because he's aware that it's a possibility. It's not as if I was walking through this wilderness.
You felt
There would never be a line where it said, and then it happened. It'd be like, and suddenly the fucking fire was doused and she had no fucking clue what to do. But with this character, it's like he's going,
he's like, oh crap.
yeah, he's
I knew
anticipating
that
these
could
things
happen.
because that's the whole point of his being out there, is that he's able to anticipate this. Like, he is specifically on this journey because he's equipped for it, because he knows on some level how dangerous wilderness is. So yeah, it's if anything, you're right, it's not suspense, but it could still be like it's mounting dread in this story, right? Like, and then it happened is like kind of telling you that like the worst of what could happen right here happened, and now he's got to deal with this part of it, and now the worst part of what happened in this already bad scenario happened again.
There's also a section right before that second one of those where he's got the fire going, and this is before the snow falls on it, and he feels like the fire is beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger, and he feels like, okay, I'm gonna make it. This is fine. I've dealt with it. It says in another minute he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist.
Yeah.
And then he could remove his wet foot gear. And while it dried, he could keep it. It's in this would could kind of future looking tense. The kind of stuff that you always talk about really liking at the end of stories.
Yeah.
But this is like it's almost like he's taking his eyes off of the moment. He's looking ahead. He's like, I've made it. Now I can like anticipate all this, what I'm going to do next, instead of being in the moment. And that's when it happened. The snow fell and doused his fire.
Right.
Because I talked before about most of the story being in the immediate moment. It's like told with like this tremendous immediacy. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. It's not literally in the present tense. It's in the past tense.
Yeah.
But you feel it as if it's happening. This is as it's happening. So that little break away from that immediacy to looking into the future is important because it leads to his downfall.
Sure. It's almost like the only other device that a narrator has in a story like this, where it's just a single character that's not having a monologue moment. Like maybe in another type of story, this main character would be explaining what he's doing. He'd be like, we're going to make the fire so we can dry our socks out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Instead of just kind of like watching him build the fire and kind of wondering as the reader, what's he thinking? What's he thinking? But I think you're right. It like acts as like a literary device. It kind of helps us appreciate this downfall, like you said.
There's one thing about when you're using tense and verbs and stuff, like a narrator, when you talk about point of view, a narrator, we often talk about it's either first, second, or third person, and we leave it at that. And that's like where you're looking from. I'm looking from the third person at a character. But what's often as important is what you're looking at, right? So in the third person, you're looking from out here at a character.
Right.
But you can also look temporally. You can look at a character's past. You can look at a character's future. You can be in the character's head, and where is the character looking? Where are his thoughts? His thoughts are in the moment. Are they ahead? Are they behind?
Wow, that's really good. It's good shit.
So when we simplify point of view, I think we lose sight of that. And, these are little things that we don't always think about, but they set up kind of, because what a story is a guide for the reader's experience. All right. Yeah. It's a guide for the reader's emotional journey to go along with characters, to go along with whatever the plot is. So in this particular story, we are in the immediate action of this character trying to save his own life.
Right.
And so when the narrator says, hey, look over here, the character's thinking about this, we're also going along with that as well. And that's, you're taking your eye off the ball in that moment. So we're doing that with him. It's one of those things that you do unconsciously a lot.
Sure.
But I think, like we talked about before with revision, like sometimes you want to go back and look at where your perspective is looking.
Yeah, and how it's affecting everything.
Yeah, how that impacts the development of the story overall.
This is unrelated, but I think part of why I enjoyed this story so much is because it is just about him surviving. There's nothing like deeper or richer going on here. It felt like an escape from a lot of the entertainment I consume these days, which is so much louder and like happening on so many levels and kind of like trying to be more than it really is, or like trying to like impact you somehow. It's just a life and death story without a whole lot about who this person is as a person, as a human. And it's still gutting because we can all identify on like a very like animal level what it's like to look death in the face and to see it coming slowly and to see that there were things that you weren't able to do to help yourself. But I wasn't crying. And I think the difference is like, if you can think about this story being blown up into a novel, if you felt the instinct to do that, like what's missing and what would like push it over the edge would be like, why do we want this character to survive? It doesn't make the story any less, but I think that's what would make it more, would be like this particular guy, he's trying to reconnect with his son, or, some stupid shit that you could add to it, that would make him like
that's
a
a workshop.
sympathetic character. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Brought this to the workshop, they'd be like, I want to know more about this man. Does he have a name? What's his family background? Is he from Germany?
That's the difference, right? That's why this is like a quiet story, because it's just about him surviving. But I still felt everything I was supposed to feel. It's almost easier to sympathize with someone looking death in the face when you know less about why you would want them to stay alive. It felt like an escape because it's so simple. Like, I want to read more Jack London when everything feels like loud and annoying. But yeah, that's my takeaway, is just like the setting. I don't think you can hope to do what he does, where you'd have to really know your setting for it to be the entirety of your story. I don't necessarily think we all need to go write stories like this, but I think, like we said, you can layer setting in, natural setting, and it can be a character, and you can layer in unnatural setting like a building, and it really, 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 really is important.
Yeah, my takeaway is, I mentioned earlier, just the sense of immediacy.
Yeah.
For this story, it works really well because everything is immediate in front of him, and like what he has to concentrate on is the moment in order to survive. But I think pursuing that sense of immediacy for any story could probably help in each scene, is like being in the moment, making us as readers be in that moment. Like that. Don't reach for backstory too much. Don't like try to get out of the scene so much. Just what is happening in the moment is usually where the drama is. It's the immediacy of the story. Like, where is the emotional moment? I want to be in the middle of that. That's where we should focus the reader on. Even those little moments in this story where he's like kind of thinking about the future, but that's immediate to his thought process. It's immediate to his emotional moment. It's where his mind is in that moment.
Right.
And so we go with him. So those kinds of things, just paying attention to the immediacy. That's my takeaway for this one.
Sweet.
And also, don't go out when it's minus 75.
All right. Thanks, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.